Senate Constitutional Amendment 10 by Senator Atkins and others, an act relating to fundamental rights.
Mr. Speaker, you may open.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, colleagues, I rise today to present Senate Constitutional Amendment 10. I am proud to be a joint author of this legislation with my legislative partner, the Senate Pro Tem. It is an issue that demands unified leadership. The Pro Tem was sadly correct when she presented this amendment on the Senate floor a week ago and said we were on the brink of the nightmarish U.S. Supreme Court decision that we witnessed on Friday. As a man, I know that overturning Roe v. Wade won't place obstacles on how I use my own body. But I also know the criminalization of abortion will lead to countless tragic personal consequences for women. We know from history that abortion bans don't end abortion. They only outlaw safe abortion. We must preserve the fundamental reproductive rights of women here in California because they are under attack elsewhere. These rights have always been fundamental rights, and last week's decision does not change that. As the honorable dissenting justices wrote last week, there are no legal reasons to eliminate the right to abortion, a right which has been legal precedent for 50 years. Their dissent quoted an earlier dissent by Justice Thurgood Marshall, which seems apt today. Marshall wrote, "Power, not reason, is the new currency of this court's decision-making." By contrast, the currency of SCA 10 is not power. Its currency is reason, compassion, and justice. Colleagues, I stand here today and appeal to your reason, your compassion, and your sense of justice. I stand here to ask Californians that all Californians have the opportunity to vote on this critical right and to vote it into our Constitution and show once again that we speak with an independent voice. I respectfully ask for your aye vote on SCA 10.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ms. Garcia, you are recognized.
Thank you. I rise as a proud principal co-author, but also as the chair of the Legislative Women's Caucus. SCA 10 would ask voters to amend the California Constitution to prohibit the state from denying or interfering with an individual's reproductive freedom in their most intimate decisions, which includes their fundamental right to choose an abortion and their fundamental right to choose or refuse contraceptives. SCA 10 would allow our voters to make it clear that in California, abortion and contraception are health care and are a private matter between a patient and their medical providers. If the last 72 hours has taught us anything, is that we can't assume a right we've had for 50 years will be available for us in the future. On Friday, for the first time in my life, I lost a right. Half of us lost a right out there. And we have a flurry of emotions out there when you talk to us, and we are having a hard time putting into words what this means. Not because we didn't expect it. The reality is that the Women's Caucus expected this because we've been under attack all our lives. And we have a whole series of bills that we introduced because we wanted to believe that we lived in a country where at the end of the day, the Supreme Court would make it clear that just because I was born with the ability to have birth did not make me a second-class citizen. But for the first time in my life, the Supreme Court told me I was a second-class citizen. And a lot of other feelings popped up in that moment. Because lots of times in our lives, we feel like second-class citizens for our gender, for our race, for having an accent, for our immigration status, for being born poor. But you want to believe that the Supreme Court was going to get it right. And when faced with the question, they were going to say, no, you're not a second-class citizen. And so as we struggle with those feelings of anger, disappointment, disillusionment, whatever else it might be, I'm proud that I live in California, where doing the right thing is always in style, where we get to say through our vote today and to our vote at the ballot box that we are not second-class citizens, that we are all created equal and we can live up to that value for us out there. And so I am excited that in California we get to be a beacon of hope for people here in California, but for anyone across the country. I am excited I get to be part of a sisterhood of 39 women in the legislature and our 5 constitutional officers that are going to do all they can, not just ensure that Californians, but all women and everyone that's able to give birth has access to the health care they need. But it's not about the health care they need. It's about their future. It's about their ability to decide when and if they have a family, and when and if to make those decisions and how that's going to impact me economically speaking. And the last thing I'm going to say is Roe being overturned is not going to stop abortions. It's going to stop safe abortions, like the speaker said. It's going to lead to complications and to deaths. But that's going to be true only for women who don't have the means, who don't have the income, who don't live in states like California out there. It's going to be true for women that look like me, who have my background, who are coming from immigrant households, from low-income households, who are brown and black out there, for our LGBT community members out there, for folks who every day feel like they are second-class citizens out there. And so we must fight to ensure that we are a beacon of hope. We must fight to ensure that we are a role model for the rest of the states out there and for Congress. And we must fight because today it's this right, but tomorrow it'll be something else. And if you don't believe it, go on Twitter. They've already talked about how they want to take away our right for contraceptives. They talk about taking away our right to marry who we want to marry and live our lives with who we love. They've talked about our educational system and attacking different systems there. They've talked about a lot of other things out there. And for the last 50 years, we've been under attack. And so I am honored to be here with our colleagues. I urge you all to vote yes on ACA 5. And I want to thank the pro tem, the speaker, the governor, and my colleagues that stand with us every day for being the warriors that we are to be a beacon of hope for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Mr. Kiley, you are recognized.
California Health and Safety Code, Section 123.468, states that if a fetus is viable, then unless the health of the mother is at risk, then, quote, the performance of an abortion is unauthorized. Mr. Speaker, I have a question for the author.
Without objection.
California law generally bars the performance of an abortion past the point of fetal viability. Would this constitutional amendment change that?
Mr. Kiley, if you could please repeat your question, sir.
California law generally bars the performance of an abortion after the point of fetal viability. Would this constitutional amendment change that?
I'll answer that question and others in my closing.
Thank you, and I recognize the author's prerogative to answer the question in their close rather than right now. I'll note there are a number of microphones up. I do think it'd be important to have clarification on this to inform the debate that is ahead of us. So maybe I'll try asking it in a different way. For those of us who are about to vote on this legislation and for the millions of Californians who would eventually vote on it, can you tell us right now whether this constitutional amendment would change California law so as to generally authorize the performance of an abortion past the point of fetal viability and up until the moment of birth?
Answer that question in my closing, which is before the members of this body will vote.
Thank you, Mr. Kiley. Dr. Weber, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as a proud co-author of SCA 10. I also rise today as a practicing board-certified obstetrician-gynecologist. And I'm sure that, or hopefully, many of us have read the updated statement that the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists put out. Their new policy of abortion specifically removes any discussion about viability. And that is because, and I will quote since we like to read, one of the most concerning medical concepts that is being misrepresented and unscientifically redefined is viability. The word viability is used in the political arena and defined in proposed legislation without regard to medical evidence or the facts of a particular case. As an obstetrician gynecologist, we understand that viability is a confluence of multiple complex factors, only one of which is gestational age. ACOG recognizes this complexity, which is different for each unique pregnancy and is best evaluated and managed within the context of a trusted relationship between the clinician and the patient. So this amendment, SCA 10, is not only compassionate, but it is rooted in current state of science, evidence-based medicine, and the legal landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. Mr. Cooper, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought about talking on this, but in the past, myself and our member from Rancho Cordova, who's not here today, talked about losing our grandmothers to abortion back in the day. And what's interesting, about 2 miles away, my daughter is at the hospital, her and her husband, about to have a baby, which is pretty cool. Yeah, I'm excited about that. So my first grandkid, but for black women, the mortality rate is 2 to 3 times higher than other women. 2 to 3 times higher, and it is what it is. You can't change that fact. So hopefully things go well with her. They're going to induce. But the fact is, because of African American women face that issue, it's about having options and not taking away those options. The great doctor from San Diego, I've spoken to her about this issue. It's an important issue. I have 4 daughters, and I'll be damned if anyone's going to tell my daughters what to do with their body. And that's real talk. There's a myriad of reasons. Medical, personal, it doesn't matter what it is. But this is real stuff. We're dealing with people's lives, and it can't be politicized. I'm as happy as hell to be a grandpa. But at the same time, if my daughter's life was on the line, if she had to make a hard decision, I would support her. But we can't have that taken away, and it's not going to be taken away here in California. And as the governor said, if it was a man's body, we wouldn't have this discussion, and I truly believe that. So I strongly urge your support for this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. Ms. Bauer-Cahan, you are recognized at your desk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise today in support of SCA 10. A few years ago, I went to speak at a Planned Parenthood event, and I thought about how they always want us to tell our abortion stories. And I thought I didn't have one. But the more I thought about it, I realized I did. It just hadn't felt like a story to me. My 3rd child, who was very much wanted, and my husband and I were trying for, was a very complicated pregnancy. And it wasn't going well. And my doctor sat with me in the midst of making decisions to save my life that could have cost me the life or the well-being of what would become my beautiful 8-year-old, and said to me, she held my hand and she said, "You have a choice, and we'll make that choice together." And my husband sat by my side, and every step of the way, we made a choice about what I would do with my body, what I would do with my family's future, always saving my life first, because I had 2 kids at home who needed me. And in the end, I was able to give birth to a beautiful baby boy who fills our family. But it hadn't felt like a story because I was a woman of privilege who had a doctor who believed in my right to choose my own future. That, members, is what every single woman should have. And on Friday, that was taken away from us. I've never lived in a country that didn't acknowledge my right to control my own body, my right to control my own future, my right to equality until Friday. And as my colleague from LA said, there were a lot of feelings swirling for many of us, especially those of us who've had to make these decisions. And so I ask that you support this resolution because it's really, really simple. If you haven't read it, it's literally 2 sentences. And all it says is that the right to control our own bodies, our reproductive freedoms, our reproductive rights are a constitutional right here in California. To address the question asked by our colleague earlier, there are fundamental rights in the Constitution, many of them federal and state. I'll give you an example, the right to free speech, that laws sometimes talk about. And when a law impinges on a constitutional right, the court has to give it the strictest scrutiny because the Constitution has said this right is fundamental to Americans or to Californians, and that is what we're doing here today. We are saying this is a fundamental right that should not be impinged upon unless it meets the strictest review by a court of law. That isn't too much to ask, members. In fact, that should be the floor, not the ceiling. And with that, I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Brower-Cahan. Ms. Wicks, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise in strong support of SCA 10. Like many of you, I was absolutely gutted and horrified by the Supreme Court decision. Not shocked because we knew it was coming, but horrified nonetheless. And I think about the fact that my daughters and all of our daughters are going to grow up in a country with less rights than we've had. And what that actually means, and the fact that 12 states have already banned abortion in the United States of America already. This decision happened on Friday. And we expect 26 states to do the same. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we do the right thing here in California. And I've spoken publicly about the abortion that I had when I was 25 years old, and I was in between jobs and sleeping on a friend's couch and had an unintended pregnancy that I was not prepared to keep, and how I went to Planned Parenthood and they welcomed me with warmth, respect, love, and information, and the ability to make my own decision. And what that decision has meant for me, I made that decision. I got to make that decision. And because I got to make that decision, I ended up on a path that has led me to where I am today. I got to work for the President of the United States. I got to meet my husband, the love of my life. I got to have two beautiful baby girls who are my everything. And I got to have a family when I was ready. So that decision was critical for me, and it was mine. And that is what we are talking about here on this floor. We have to do everything in this state to say to the rest of the world that here in California, we are truly a reproductive freedom state for all, that we have the ability to make these decisions. This needs to be enshrined into our Constitution, because I can assure you, the right-wing agenda that is coming after this is coming after many other things, as our colleague from Los Angeles said. So it is incumbent upon all of us right now to stand up and press the green button, an aye on SCA 10. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wicks. Ms. Friedman, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I honestly was not going to speak on this resolution today, although I very much support it, but I did want to add another perspective. As many of you know, because of my experience having cancer, I was unable to have a child of my own. My husband and I very much wanted a child, and so we went through several years of trying to adopt. Very difficult process. And even though every day I hoped to get a call from a woman who was pregnant and didn't want to parent, I would never for one moment have dreamed of taking that choice away from any of those women. And our experience of going through open adoption also taught me a lot about the different pressures that women who are pregnant often are facing when they have an unintended pregnancy. Sometimes there's a narrative out there that we even heard repeated from a Supreme Court justice, unfortunately, that this really isn't such a big deal to carry a child for those 9 months, bear a child, and then place that child up for adoption. But I will tell you from the experience that I had with our own birth mother and from the many women that I know who have placed children up for adoption, that there are many, many women who will go through the rest of their lives feeling the loss of that child that they are unable to raise themselves. That is a very difficult choice for many women and a really hard path to walk, and one that I think people take way too lightly. Not only that, but for many women, the very act of being pregnant puts them in physical danger from family members, from ex-husbands, current husbands, boyfriends, who maybe aren't the father, and we don't talk about that enough. For some women, the shame that they feel from their own family, being ostracized, if they're young, being in school and being pregnant, what that will do to that person. There are children, back before there was abortion that was allowed, who were sent away, literally sent away to have children, and never really welcomed back in their community, who carried that stigma for the rest of their lives. And in most cases, when abortions happen, when people have proper medical care, you're talking about a piece of tissue that's so small that you couldn't even identify it with the naked eye, much less have distinct organs. So all of those protections, all that safety for women, the ability to choose if and when they want to parent, are now at risk. And from the perspective of an adoptive parent, for other adoptive potential parents in the future, this is not what any of us should want. This is not what anybody should want. And it is beyond reprehensible and shocking to me that this is the path now that this country is walking down, given the experience that my mother and that our grandmothers had watching their friends literally die because they were so desperate. And I think the men who want to talk about this clearly have no idea of the desperation that an unwanted pregnancy can have on a woman and on a family. So listen to the voices of those women. Think about those women who died, who were so desperate that they risked their lives and died to try to regain that control. And the idea that we're going back to that, shame on us.
Thank you, Ms. Friedman. Ms. Carrillo, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I was this morning at the Commission for the Status of Women to talk about the impact of Roe v. Wade. And over the last few days, I've had several conversations with friends, family members, my sisters. I'm the eldest of 5 girls, and what it means to the Latino community and the intersectionality between being an immigrant and being a woman in the United States at this moment. I was born in the country of El Salvador, which is one of 3 nations in Central America that completely ban abortion, and one of 24 around the world that criminalize abortion and even put women in jails for having a miscarriage or stillbirth. It ranges from 2 to 50 years. When we talk about unaccompanied minors and women at our borders, an issue that we have been managing and trying to be helpful with for the past few years, many of those women are fleeing El Salvador and several other Central American nations because of the rights of women being completely banned and non-existent. The rights for contraception, the right to family planning, it only exists if you are wealthy, because then you can travel and go outside of the country. Banning abortion and the overturning Roe v. Wade won't ban abortion, it just makes it dangerous for women and individuals seeking that care. In speaking to friends over the weekend, several white women told me that for the first time, they felt that they had a right taken from them and they were scared. And my response to them, with all love, was, welcome to our world. Welcome to what it feels like to be an immigrant, to be formally undocumented, to be a refugee, to be seeking asylum, to be a woman of color who has constantly, day in and day out, faced threats to our civil liberties and our rights to simply exist and live in dignity. This is incredibly complicated, but it's also incredibly easy. And that we, in the state of California, have an opportunity to ensure that women feel safe, that pregnant individuals have access to health care and comprehensive reproductive justice and reproductive freedom, and that anyone across the nation, can come to California and seek care without being afraid. You don't have to look far to see the direction of our nation. Just look to my home country, who's become incredibly conservative, who, again, as I share, jails women for having a miscarriage, something that we are starting to see in legislation across the nation. More than 25 states are moving forward complete banning of abortion services. And it is scary. And while at times over the last few days I have felt helpless, I also feel incredibly hopeful to be with all of you here in this body, to be able to move SCA 10 forward, to ensure that anyone, requesting access, wanting information on abortion services and comprehensive reproductive freedom and reproductive justice gets it in our state. And I would just urge that you look at the consequences of banning Roe v. Wade and what it could potentially look like, because it already exists around the world. And you don't have to look far. And some of us didn't wake up when Roe v. Wade was overturned and felt it for the first time. Many of us, many women, across the state and across the nation and around the world have felt our justice and our freedom be infringed upon by decisions made by mostly white males. And that decision that Supreme Court made hurts all of us, and it hurts families. And I just ultimately also want to give a shout out to all the promotoras, all the women, all the immigrant women, all the healthcare providers that day in, day out risk their lives and work in healthcare centers that constantly get threatened, only to ensure that women and people have access to comprehensive reproductive health care. And I just urge you to please think about the future, think about what this means, and please support the rights of women and the rights of families to be able to have autonomy over their own bodies. And I strongly encourage and I vote on SCA 10. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carrillo. Mr. Bryan, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. First, I want to thank my colleague from San Diego for her comments rooted in science and evidence and her lived and learned experience. My mother got pregnant from a rape. She was a rape survivor in Texas. A white woman with a black baby. There was enough factors there for it to be a difficult decision for her. And she chose to give birth to me and gave me up for adoption. I get asked all the time why that doesn't make me pro-life. And it's because my mother had options. She had choices, and they were hers to make. And I refuse to be tokenized to undermine the bodily autonomy of women and childbearing people. And so I'm proud to be here on this floor today to vote for this constitutional amendment. Because here in California, not only do we protect the rights of women and childbearing people, but we also support whatever decision is made by bolstering the social safety nets that provide all children with opportunity. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. Ms. Rubio, you're recognized. Members, if you'd like to participate in debate, please raise your microphones at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have been debating in my head to see if I would get up and actually speak. But I remember a story by, actually I've heard Sister Joanne Chittister, the Benedictine nun, talking about pro-life and pro-birth. I sit and have sat on Sub-1, Budget Sub-1 Committee, where we discuss issues about welfare, food stamps, and protecting the most vulnerable of our populations. When I have a debate with some of my colleagues, we talk about the difference between pro-life and pro-birth. We hear pro-life, make sure that the quote-unquote the fetuses are protected, that the child must be born, and a whole variety of all of the discussions that we've had here. But when it comes to voting on issues in Sub-1 and voting on a budget, most of the time my colleagues vote no on the safety net programs like welfare and food stamps, because there's a difference between pro-life and pro-birth. We talk about how we want the fetuses to be born, except for once they're born, we don't want to provide the resources for those children to be raised. We've all heard it, the welfare queens, they're taking advantage of the system, all of the safety net programs, they don't want to work, You've heard all of these debates. That is a big difference between being pro-life and pro-birth. If you are pro-life, you will support all of the programs that will help those children be raised. I lived and worked in a low-income community, specifically in Fontana. A third of my students were African American, a third of my students were Latino, and a third of the students were white. What they had in common, that they were all poor. All of them, we were in a school that was about 99% free and reduced lunch. But again, the debate is not about how we're going to help these kids. The debate is about making sure that these kids are born. Once they're born, we stop taking care of them. I know the debate is going to go on forever and ever, but rarely do the fathers have these issues. It's mainly the women who, once they have those children, have to make sure that those children are raised. I want to thank all of my colleagues in support. And again, I want to end with a discussion that I had with my 15-year-old son. He said, "Mom, what are we banning in men's bodies?" And I didn't have an answer for him, because we're banning nothing for men to choose what they do with their bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rubio. Again, members, if you'd like to participate in debate, please raise your microphones at this time. Mr. Bennett, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For those of you in the Assembly that can remember, like I do, the 1950s and 60s, when whole hospital wards were devoted to infections from abortions that were not medically performed, I think that we have a responsibility to remind everybody how desperate life can be for women, that they would engage in such risky behavior, and how difficult those infections were to treat, and how many women were scarred or died as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Gabriel, you are recognized at your desk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise today in support of SCA 10. I just want to, not much I can add to, on top of the eloquent comments we've heard from so many of our colleagues. I did want to make two observations. One, I think many of us have had a sense, maybe over the past couple of years, that our country is moving backwards, and that fundamental rights that people have long fought for are unwinding. And it is very jarring, I think, for many of us to see our country move backwards in real time, in such a fundamental and profound way. And that is something that I think all of us are still struggling to internalize, but we are fortunate, as many of our colleagues mentioned, because here in California we can do something about that. We can't do something about the Supreme Court's decision as it applies to the entire country. We can do something about protecting our residents here in the state of California. And certainly that is something that can have implications beyond our borders. And that is by passing this constitutional amendment, which will enshrine the fundamental right to reproductive freedom in our state constitution. And I've been pondering the question that our colleague from suburban Sacramento County asked about the statute and the viability threshold, and I took a look at it, and it turns out it's a little more complicated than he suggested, that there are other issues at stake there beyond viability in the analysis and in the statute. And I'm not sure exactly why it's relevant, but it does underscore a very important point here. A statute is something that can be changed by a vote of this legislature at any time. It can be stricken, it can be enhanced, the details can be changed. But what we are doing today is giving the voters the opportunity to enshrine in our state constitution to afford a higher level of protection to a fundamental right. And that is what's so important about doing this. And I believe with every part of my being that the voters in the state of California will overwhelmingly pass this constitutional amendment, because people want that fundamental right. They want to make that choice for themselves for all of the reasons that we have heard expressed today from people of all different walks of life and all different backgrounds. And I believe that the people of the state of California deserve the opportunity to make that choice, both about putting it in the Constitution and ultimately about these profound questions. So I think that the question that was asked actually underscores why it is so important that we do that, and why it is so important that we pass SCA 10. So with that, would respectfully request an aye vote in support of this very important measure.
And Ms. Bonta, you are recognized.
Colleagues, I rise today asking that you, as a co-author, that you vote for SCA 10. Last week, the reckless Supreme Court decision to overturn a 50-year precedent to protect our right, my right, to have an abortion. In doing so, they condemned women for generations to come to death. My heart hurts as I held my 22-year-old daughter and she looked me in the eye and said, "Should I have a baby now so that I can be certain that I can proceed through that medical process with having full autonomy over the decisions that I need to make?" I didn't know what else to do but hug her tighter. And when I think about the impact that this has, particularly on women of color, I'm all the more taken aback. As we know, a woman of color is more likely to face maternal death, mortality. We know that women of color are more likely to live in states where abortion has already been taken away in the most restrictive abortion laws. We know that women of color are more likely to face barriers to abortions and other reproductive and mental health services. So this is an attack on women and birthing people. This is an absolute attack on women of color and birthing people. And all women for sure. And I know that we need to stand in solidarity in this moment. But I also know that we need to lift up and make sure that we are centering the impacts of this decision, because we have a long way to go. And this constitutional amendment is California's first stand, along with the impressive legislative package that the Legislative Women's Caucus has put together, to be able to ensure that when women are coming and when birthing people are coming to the state of California, they can be assured that their right to bodily autonomy, that their right to reproductive health, that the right to not feel and be second-class citizens will be granted. With that, I respectfully request your vote.
Thank you, Ms. Bonta. Ms. Quirksilla, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I reluctantly rise because this is a personal conversation. And our stories as women mean something. And too often we stand in sides. I don't believe anybody's minds will be changed today by all the stories. The people who support choice will continue to support choice, and those who don't, won't. The stories about women having children unplanned mean something for those children for the rest of their lives. My mother had her first child at the age of 15. As a young Catholic woman, Latina, she had 10 children. I was number 6. And because she had many children, there were many things that came with coming with a big family. Yes, joy. Every one of them she's proud of. She's proud of me. But with that came a family of poverty. I didn't go to preschool. I didn't go to Head Start. I didn't have those types of opportunities that other families have when there are planned pregnancies. When people have children at very young age or unplanned, from the time those children are born, they can already be at a disadvantage. Things that we don't even think about, the types of food they have access, their housing, prenatal care. Many times we know that women in poverty sometimes don't even get their health visit until they're well into their 6th month. We have some brand new fathers on this floor. Think about the care your wives have been given from the moment they are even planning a pregnancy, taking prenatal vitamins, reading the most updated books. But it's not just about prenatal care, it's about maternity care. It's about maternity leave. It's about child care, health care, preschool, and education. And if we want to force women to have unplanned pregnancies, are we going to be there to help support them? We've seen too often on this floor votes against these types of programs. All of us have social media. I put a post on my Facebook, and I have a mixed group of people on my Facebook, and I like that because I want to be able to talk to not just Democrats, not just people of choice, and right away, 300 comments, both sides. 300 comments, some of them very vicious from one side to the other. So, like I said, I do not think we're going to change any minds, but we have to get to the point where we can start to talk, where we can converse, and if we want somebody to do something against their will, then where are we to support them? I was in a hearing just this week on the floor on the Senate side where my colleague from Cerritos was presenting her bill, and literally the people speaking against it were calling her and the others in the chamber baby killers. This has to stop, because it isn't just about choices to have a child, but it's about us being able to live, work, and stand side by side and respect each other. So with this, I will end with, when we come to votes that mean something about raising a child, investing in education, investing in health care, think about how that single mom, how that woman who maybe doesn't have an education is going to raise those kids on her own, often as a single mother. I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Quirk-Silva. Mr. Vopel, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, members, I have two things. Number one, a question to ponder. And then number two, my amateur take on the Supreme Court ruling. First one, to ponder. I've always wondered, and I've always discussed with my pastors, when does a baby get a soul? If you believe in souls and that we're God's creatures, when does the baby get the soul? Is it at conception, which some people believe, or is it at birth, which some people believe? And it's not just Christians. It's Buddhists. It's Shinto. I can't speak for our imam, but I believe the Muslims believe in a soul. So those people that believe that a baby has a soul somewhere along the line. So if you abort that baby, you're aborting one of the creations. So anyway, you might want to think about that. And then number two is, and I pondered this, and once again, I'm an amateur. I'm not an attorney, but in my mind, the Supreme Court ruling simply freed all the states to make up their mind about abortion state by state. Now this SCA 10 will pass in this House today, and it'll go on the ballot. And if the people of California decide to vote for it and pass it, then that means California will allow complete abortions. And that's okay. I don't support it. I'm against it. But that would be the will of the people. Now, if a state like Oklahoma or Texas want to preclude abortions, that's that state. And that is the Constitution, because the founders were more concerned about states' freedoms than they were about the federal government. Of course, over 200 and something years, that has changed. Now we're centralized. But the point I'm making is each state will decide this factor. And stop and think. Let's say you're in a state that precludes abortion. You're within a day or two drive of a state that will allow it. So it's not like we're killing abortion throughout the United States. That's my points. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members.
Ms. Wilson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise in support of SCA 10. The rights of the unborn cannot supersede the rights of the person carrying them. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
And Mr. Gallagher, members, if you'd like to participate, please raise your microphones at this time. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise in opposition to SCA 10. I know that this is an issue that is very sensitive. It's an issue that has divided our country and people for a very long time. And I guess my hope is, like my colleague from Fullerton, is that eventually maybe we can come as this might be something that could bring us together, ultimately, to talk about how we do better for both women and children. And I've heard a lot of those comments on this floor today, which I think is a very positive thing. And as one of my colleagues said, as a man, I could never imagine what it's like to be in a crisis pregnancy. But I've been married to my wife for 19 years. And I've been through 4 high-risk pregnancies with her and a miscarriage. So I don't come to this issue lightly. And that was a very challenging time for us, walking through that. 2 of those children are teenage women now. And you better believe I want them to have every opportunity that a man does in this country. But the reason that I can't support this constitutional amendment today is because of the twins who came last. My twin boys are alive and they are people. And they were alive and they were people at 18 weeks. When at UCSF, they were prepared to go do surgery on their hearts to save them in utero. When they did echocardiograms on them to discover what was going on that was causing the detrimental thing that was going on to them in the womb. And they were alive and they were people at 23 and a half weeks when they wanted to come. And thankfully, they didn't come at that time. At 30 weeks, they did come. 10 weeks early. And you know what? They looked like just like any other baby that was born. They were just a little bit smaller. 3 pounds and 2.5 pounds. They were alive and they are a person. They're people. And our law has to begin to recognize that. And that's why I can't support this constitutional amendment today, because of what's missing from it. It says nothing about their rights. Nothing about their rights. And we have to think about that. Because quite honestly, I think we can make a better policy. I think this legislative body is capable of making a better policy. For my teenage daughters and for my twins. And we do have to think about that, because right now, the wording that says nothing about late term, it puts no restrictions on it. And so babies like my twins at 30 weeks, their lives could be taken. And I don't think that's the right balance, folks. I don't think that's the right balance. We can do better. And that's why I ask you today to vote against this constitutional amendment. Thank you, members.
Mr. Levine, you are recognized at your desk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members. Thank you to to our authors, the Speaker, the Pro Tem, I'm proud to stand with you as a co-author of this constitutional amendment. This is just the first of many steps that we will need to take to protect Californians. And we see this as this Supreme Court rolls out more and more opinions of their vision of a dark, theologic America that we must live in according to their worldview. This dark theology, which we're somehow blessed to protect the rights of women here in California because of how they ruled on Dobbs, but that children today are really going to feel forced to pray in school with their teachers and their coaches because that is not done state by state. And that in this instance with SCA 10, we're fortunate because the opinion of the case that they were dealing with made them decide that states had a right to have their own position. But if they had a different legal issue before them, we might not have this. And we would need to determine how do we protect the rights of all Californians when this other law, American law, doesn't see that California can have its own laws, like we now see with the prayer in school issue. So, I definitely, recommend a vote for SCA 10. Our work is getting cut out for us every day as these opinions are rolled out, and it's only going to become more difficult as the years go by. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. Thank you, members. Seeing no other members seeking recognition at this time, Ms. Cervantes will be closing on the item. Ms. Cervantes, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, for allowing me to close on Senate Constitutional Amendment 10. I rise as a proud co-author of this constitutional amendment. First, I'd like to address the question by our colleague from Rockland, and I defer that answer to the comments made by our colleagues from San Diego and Woodland Hills. This bill just ensures that all Californians enjoy reproductive freedoms and that they have the ability to make these decisions themselves. I'm not going to mince words here. I'm outraged by the decision made by the Supreme Court of the United States. As a mother to triplets by choice, I know that the decision to start a family or not is a deeply personal one that should be made between yourself and your healthcare provider. Last week, 5 unelected activist justices on the Supreme Court took away the right to make that decision for millions and millions of women and birthing people in our country. Let's be clear. The Supreme Court is effectively criminalizing pregnancy. And it's unfathomable that these justices, 4 of whom are men, would undermine the precedent that has protected the freedom for women and birthing people for generations. The burden of this reckless decision falls disproportionately, as we heard, on people historically facing barriers to accessing health care. Those individuals living with disabilities, our Black, Latino, Indigenous communities, our LGBTQ communities, people living in rural communities, our working families who are barely making ends meet. Regardless of income or geographic location, every person deserves access to reproductive care without barriers or political interference. We know from history that this decision will not end abortions. It is simply making them clandestine and dangerous in states that outlaw abortion rights. In those states, abortions will move from regulated professional medical clinics into the shadows. And as a result, many people will tragically lose their lives seeking abortion that they once were able to safely access when Roe was still the law of the land. And let us be honest about what was taken away, what this choice means. In effect, the court is now forcing millions of women and birthing people with ectopic pregnancies to face probable death. And as a personal moment of privilege, members, this is something I was almost faced with before giving birth to my triplets. And in several states, women and birthing people will now be forced to carry the child of a rapist or incestuous relative to term. The court is not only taking this fundamental choice away, it is forcing people to suffer physical, emotional, psychological consequences of an unwanted pregnancy, even if it means losing their lives. And if you think that the Supreme Court will simply stop at the travesty of overturning Roe, then let us just look at Justice Clarence Thomas' concurring opinion. In it, Justice Thomas states his belief that the court should revisit precedents protecting the constitutional right of marriage equality and access to contraceptives. As a member of both the California LGBTQ caucus and a member of the Legislative Women's Caucus, I am deeply concerned that this right-wing activist majority on the Supreme Court seems hell-bent on taking the rights of women and birthing people and our LGBTQ plus community. This is why, while for now we may feel safe here in California, we cannot rest on our laurels. It is only a matter of time before this will directly affect you and the people you love. We must enshrine the right to an abortion in our state constitution. This is the essential purpose of SCA 10. Passage of this amendment in the legislature and then at the ballot box by the voters of California, it is but the first of many steps we can and will take to protect abortion access here in our Golden State. But we also cannot abandon people who do not have that same luxury in other states that value reproductive freedoms like ours. As we know, if that freedom is in question in just one state, we cannot rightly consider them safe throughout the rest of our country. While California will remain a state where these deeply personal decisions will be made by women and birthing people, we cannot rest until we have autonomy over our bodies in every state once again. California will not stop fighting for reproductive freedom, and neither will I. To those of you who are watching this debate, if you are outraged by what the Supreme Court has done to the rights of women and birthing people, I am with you. If you feel devastated, if you feel disheartened or despair, I am with you. And I ask you to join us in this cause. You were born in this moment for a reason. We will not back down. So, colleagues, I respectfully ask to help us take this fight by casting your aye vote for Senate Constitutional Amendment 10 to protect reproductive freedom here in our Golden State.
And the clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. This takes 54. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the vote. Ayes 58, noes 16.